Vicki hired me 22 years ago, about a month after she herself had been named executive director of the agency. So we've had many long hours, long years together. And I thought I'm a substitute speaker tonight for someone else who couldn't be here, so I'm going to have to cheat a little bit, but I wanted to share a few things with you about where we've come from, where Wide Horizons began, and where we are now to sort of tie in Vicki's legacy that she's led us through. So as many of you probably know or may not know, our Wide Horizons began as a very small grassroots organization started by a few parents at a church basement in Newton. And those families got together during the Vietnam War to support about 100 orphans who were living in a nutrition center in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And that was in 1972. So there were no adoptions going on. It was just getting food and money to care for these kids who didn't have any option, were war orphans. And a few years later, when Saigon fell in 1975 and there was the orphan baby lifts to the U.S. and children, it was discovered that Vietnamese children needed to find adoptive families in the United States. And my friend's house, as it was called then, worked to find families right here in Massachusetts for some of those kids. And that's how the first adoptions began. And then shortly after that, they expanded the services into domestic work, helping birth parents make decisions here in the U.S., which we still do, and helping families train them, as Adam said, for adoption, prepare them for the needs of children, and more importantly, serve kids overseas. So Vicki, through her, our 37-year history, Vicki's been here for most of it, and she really guided us with the child welfare focus. And I know it's already been mentioned tonight, you'll probably hear it mentioned again, but Vicki really kept us on mission to stay child-focused. That's why Wide Horizons has such a great reputation. That's why families come to us. That's why you've all chosen us, is because of the legacy and the spirit behind the mission, that it's placing children and finding families for those kids, but also helping the kids who are left behind. And Vicki's really kept us on target all of those years. And I remember some years in probably the 80s or 90s when we started getting the internet and we'd get emails and our work became more demanding, and families wanted services sometimes that we couldn't even provide fast enough and didn't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of bureaucracies overseas and here that were in the way of them getting their child, and we had to manage all that, and Vicki, through all of that, kept the focus on serving the families but keeping the focus of the children first. And through those efforts, I'm proud to share with you that at last count we've placed 12,000 children into loving adopted families, domestically and internationally. And in today's adoption world, we're seeing our needs change. Today, the children who need us the most are newborns of African American origin here in the U.S. we're recruiting families for, and then overseas, they're primarily children over the age of 3, older sibling groups, or children with some kind of a special medical need who can't find homes in their country. So our work's gotten more challenging. There's a lot more bureaucracy than there used to be years ago. There are a lot more laws in place that are there to protect children, but mean it's a lot harder to actually get the legal and administrative process done to get them here. So as our work has become more challenging, we have still focused on meeting the needs of the children. So although our adoption placements are declining in recent years, which is very the same as the rest of the nation, that fewer international orphans are coming into the United States than they did before, we're still meeting the needs of those kids who need us. So through Vicki's leadership, we really got more clinically astute at preparing the right families. As Adam said, making sure they do well successfully, providing post-adoption services, so when families call us 7 years later, there's a social worker there to help them answer their questions. And we've really kept that mission, again, at the forefront. And then the other piece that Vicki's really been instrumental with is making sure that we stayed focused on the kids who were left behind. And through those 37 years of history, we've raised $13 million that's gone overseas to help programs, help kids who will never have a loving family the years, it started as really grassroots efforts. We'd collect used clothing from families and shoes, and we'd pack these giant suitcases, and Vicki and I and many of our colleagues would travel overseas. Vicki and I in particular took quite a few trips to Latin America together. And we'd pack, I shouldn't tell you what we called them, but they were huge suitcases, almost as high as I am, and we called them body bags because they were so heavy. And we knew that if they were packed full, the airlines had a little looser restrictions then. I knew that if I could drag it, but I couldn't quite pick it up, it wasn't over the 70-pound airline limit. But what we found out was when we went overseas and we're going inter-Latin America from country to country, say from Costa Rica to Colombia, there were nowhere near 70-pound limits, and they would always try to charge us extra baggage money. And so we'd beg and plead and show our little letters with the gold seals on them that we'd made up in the office before we left. And if nothing else worked, we would just start crying. And usually that did. Once in Cambodia, it didn't fly, but that was the only time. We usually got away and begged and pleaded and opened up the bags and showed them that it was toys and shoes for kids, and they usually let us go. And so over the years, we ended up really expanding into very significant projects. So many of you here in the room have helped us recently with some of the projects, schools and health clinics and sponsorship programs, sustainable family empowerment programs, education for older orphans who are aging out to be able to go to school so that they're not on the street when they age out of the orphanage. Some really compelling things that back then seemed impossible in the days when we were just bringing a few shoes and a few toys to them. And so Vicki's spirit was really behind that as well. And I'm thrilled to share with you that we expect out of our placements next year, we expect over half of them to be older and special needs children. That's historic in the agency. We've never reached that number before. And although we started serving those 100 orphans at that nutrition center in Vietnam, through our outreach and humanitarian aid work, we now reach over 800,000 families and children through some of the community-based projects. When you add up, how many kids can be served by the classrooms we've built, or how many parents and children can get medical care now in communities. And I just had the good fortune of being in Ethiopia in March, and it was just, my trip corresponded with the delivery of an ambulance that some of our adoptive parents had raised money for to go with a clinic that we had also built in northern Ethiopia. And they timed this, so they asked me to please hand over the ambulance to the mayor. Well, little did I know that they timed this whole ceremony for a big holiday in Ethiopia called Adwa Victory Day. And I had to go to a stadium full of 40,000 people and turn over this ambulance. But the ambulance is being used at the clinic. They have 2 midwives, one to stay at the clinic and one to ride in the ambulance. And it's going to go to remote villages in Ethiopia so that mothers in labor no longer die on their way to the hospital. Remote village where they literally have to be in labor for 3 days and walk sometimes 2, 4, 6, 8 hours, or be carried by hand on a hand stretcher. And this ambulance is now going to save the lives of so many children. And since that clinic's been built, nobody's looked back. So, of course, with all of that, our staff works incredibly hard. Sometimes we wonder how we can do it, but we would never, ever be able to do it without all of you. Those of you who've come forward to give a loving and successful family to children, as well as so many of you who've supported our projects. And I wanted to let you know that I've been told that $100,000 was raised just for tonight's event in honor of Vicki.